March 2, 1943. 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea. A formation of what German advisors embedded with Japanese forces called the ugliest bombers they had ever seen approached at nearly 350 miles per hour. The twin-engine aircraft looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, their glazed noses too big for their fuselages, their wings stubby and graceless compared to the sleek fighters that ruled the European skies. One Luftwaffe liaison officer stationed in Naval had written in his report just weeks earlier that the Douglas A-20 was nothing more than a French export reject that the Americans were desperately trying to make relevant. He described them as medium bombers trying to do a fighter's job, too slow to escape, too lightly armed to fight, and flying so low they were practically begging to be shot down. Within the next 63 minutes, his entire assessment would be proven catastrophically wrong as those ungainly bombers turned the Battle of the Bismarck Sea into one of the most lopsided massacres in naval warfare history. What that German officer did not know, what the Japanese naval commanders watching from their destroyer decks could not have imagined, was that those A-20 Havocs were not medium bombers at all anymore. They had been transformed into something the world had never seen before, a hybrid monster that combined the firepower of a heavy fighter with the payload of a bomber and the maneuverability of an attack aircraft. Each nose had been gutted and replaced with 650 caliber machine guns. Some versions carried 8, capable of pouring 3,000 rounds per minute into anything unlucky enough to be in front of them. The bomb bays had been modified to carry fragmentation clusters and skip bombs, weapons specifically designed to skip across water like flat stones and detonate against ship hulls below the waterline. And they were being flown by pilots who had trained for months to deliver those weapons from an altitude so low that Japanese gunners would have less than 4 seconds to acquire, track, and fire before the Havocs were already past them and their ships were burning. The A-20 Havoc was born from rejection, modified through desperation, and perfected in blood. The United States Army Air Corps had initially turned it down in 1938, calling it unnecessary when they already had bombers in development. France bought it instead, used a handful before their nation fell, and the British inherited the rest, renaming it the Boston and using it primarily for night operations because they did not trust it in daylight. The Soviets took over 3,000 of them through Lend-Lease and flew them into oblivion on the Eastern Front, where lifespan was measured in missions, not months. And the Americans, who had rejected it first, eventually built more than 7,400 of them, making the A-20 one of the most produced bombers of the entire war. But numbers alone do not tell you why German pilots stopped laughing. Statistics do not explain why Japanese soldiers call them Black Death. Production figures cannot convey the sound of 650 caliber machine guns ripping through a true concentration at eye level, or what it felt like to watch a skip bomb bounce 3 times across calm water before it disappeared under your ship's hull and detonated. The Douglas Aircraft Company designed the A-20 with one philosophy that American engineers had perfected during the Industrial Revolution. If something does not work, do not redesign it from scratch. Modify what you have until it does exactly what you need. The original DB-7 prototype that first flew in January 1938 was intended as a private venture, a light bomber that could be sold to export customers who wanted modern aircraft but could not afford the development costs of designing their own. It had tricycle landing gear, which was revolutionary at the time when most aircraft still had tail wheels that made them nose-heavy and difficult to control on the ground. It had 2 Wright R-2600 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, mounted on wings that were designed short and wide to maximize lift at low speeds. The fuselage was narrow, just wide enough for a pilot and gunner to sit in tandem, with a glazed nose for a bombardier and a small dorsal turret for defensive armament. On paper, it was unremarkable. In the air, it was a revelation. French test pilots who evaluated the DB-7 in early 1939 reported that it handled like a fighter despite being a bomber, responsive to control inputs, stable in turns, and fast enough to outrun most of the fighters that potential enemies were fielding at the time. The French Armée de l'Air ordered 100 immediately, then increased the order to 270, then kept ordering until the fall of France made further deliveries impossible. The British took over the French contracts and designated the aircraft as the Boston for day bombing and the Havoc for night fighting, a distinction that reflected their uncertainty about what to do with an aircraft that did not fit neatly into any existing category. The Soviets requested them specifically by name after their liaison officers saw them in British service, and Joseph Stalin himself allegedly told his procurement officers to acquire as many as the Americans were willing to send. And the United States Army Air Forces, which had rejected the design in 1938, watched all of this foreign interest and quietly reversed their decision, ordering the A-20 into production in 1940 with modifications that would make it even more capable than the export versions. The key to the A-20's success was not any single feature, but the combination of features that made it adaptable to almost any role. Its speed, over 340 miles per hour at 12,000 feet, made it faster than many fighters at the start of the war. Its range, over 2,000 miles with external tanks, gave it strategic reach that light bombers were not supposed to have. Its payload, for 1,000 pounds of bombs or depth charges or rockets, or any combination thereof, matched aircraft twice its size. And its structural strength, a result of Douglas building it with the same stress tolerances as their commercial airliners, meant it could absorb damage that would tear apart lighter designs. But what made it truly dangerous was something that did not appear on any specification sheet. It was small enough and agile enough to be flown at altitudes where larger bombers could not survive, and it was tough enough to come home even when flown through defensive fire that should have been lethal. Captain Edward Larner of the 5th Air Force had flown B-17s over Europe before being transferred to the Pacific Theater in late 1942, and his first reaction upon seeing the A-20 Havoc was confusion about why anyone would want to fly a medium bomber in a theater where heavy bombers were struggling to survive. He had been trained in high-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine that the Air Corps had spent the entire pre-war period developing, where bombers flew at 25,000 feet and dropped their ordnance from altitudes where enemy fighters and flak could barely reach them. The A-20 flew at the opposite end of the altitude spectrum, often below 100 feet, sometimes at 50, occasionally at 30 when the mission required absolute precision. Larner thought it was suicide. His squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who had been flying a 20 since the Java campaign, told him that high-altitude bombing in the Pacific was suicide, that Japanese ships and bases were too small and too mobile to hit from 4 miles up, and that if he wanted to actually destroy the enemy instead of just making noise, he would learn to love the Havoc or he would transfer out. Larner stayed. 3 months later, he had 17 confirmed ship kills and a distinguished flying cross, and he told a war correspondent that flying an A-20 at wave-top height was the only way to fight a war where the enemy respected nothing except overwhelming violence delivered with surgical precision. The transformation of the A-20 from a conventional bomber into a ground attack monster began in Australia in early 1942, when Major Paul Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces reservist, looked at the glazed nose full of bomb sight equipment and decided it was wasted space. Gunn was a maverick, the kind of officer who ignored regulations when they interfered with killing the enemy, and he had noticed that every time A-20s went after Japanese shipping at low altitude, they took heavy losses from defensive fire because they could not suppress the gunners before dropping their bombs. He proposed replacing the bombardier station with a solid nose packed with forward-firing machine guns, turning the A-20 into a gunship that could strafe its target into silence before releasing ordnance. His superiors told him it was impossible, that the aircraft's center of gravity would be thrown off, that the recoil from multiple heavy machine guns would tear the nose structure apart, and that even if it worked, pilots would not be able to aim accurately while flying at high speed and low altitude. Gunn ignored them, found a wrecked A-20 in a salvage yard, installed 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose using parts from a crashed P-39, test-fired the installation, and proved that not only did it work, but the recoil actually stabilized the aircraft in level flight. Within 6 months, field modification kits were being produced in Australia and shipped to every A-20 unit in the Pacific, and Douglas Aircraft began producing factory model 20GS with 6 50 caliber machine guns in a solid nose as standard equipment. Some units added 2 more guns and underwing pods, giving a total of 8, which created a cone of fire that one pilot described as being able to saw a small ship in half. The rate of fire was devastating, 3,000 rounds per minute minimum, 6,000 if all 8 guns were installed, with every 5th round a tracer so that pilots could walk their fire onto the target without needing a gun sight. The effective range was 1,200 yards, but most 20 pilots fired from 400 yards or less, close enough to see the expressions on enemy faces before the bullets arrived, close enough to feel the heat from explosions as they pulled up and over burning targets. And because the A-20 could carry its full bomb load, even with the gun nose installed, it became a weapons platform that could strafe, bomb, and strafe again on the same pass, something no other aircraft in the theater could do. The tactical doctrine that made the A-20 lethal was called skip bombing. It was exactly what it sounded like, bombs released at extremely low altitude and high speed that skipped across the water surface like stones until they struck the target's hull and detonated. The technique had been theorized before the war, but never successfully implemented because it required precision that human pilots were not supposed to be capable of achieving under combat conditions. You had to approach the target at exactly the right altitude, usually between 50 and 100 feet, at exactly the right speed, usually between 250 and 300 miles per hour, and release the bomb at exactly the right distance, usually between 300 and 400 yards, so that it would skip 2 or 3 times and strike the hull at or below the waterline. If you were too high, the bomb would skip over the target. If you were too low, it would detonate on first impact with the water. If you were too fast, it would shatter on contact. If you were too slow, it would sink before reaching the target. The margin of error was measured in feet and fractions of seconds, and you had to calculate all of it while flying through anti-aircraft fire from ships that knew exactly what you were trying to do and were doing everything possible to kill you before you released. Lieutenant Joseph Bloomer flew A-20s with the 89th Bomb Squadron and participated in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the engagement that proved skip bombing was not just possible, but devastatingly effective when executed by trained crews. On March 2, 1943, his squadron was part of a coordinated attack on a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce garrisons in New Guinea, 8 transports and 8 destroyers carrying nearly 7,000 troops. The attack plan called for high-altitude B-17s to scatter the convoy and force the ships to maneuver, followed by A-20s coming in at wave-top height to skip-bomb the transports while they were disorganized. Bloomer's aircraft was carrying 4 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses, meaning they would penetrate the hull before exploding, and his nose guns were loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds to suppress deck guns during the approach. He described the run as the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of his life, diving from 2,000 feet to 50 feet in less than 10 seconds, leveling off so close to the water that his propellers were kicking up spray, seeing the transport's hull grow larger in his windscreen until it filled his entire field of vision, firing his nose guns at point-blank range and watching the tracers tear through the superstructure like it was made of paper, then releasing his bombs and pulling up so hard that his vision grayed out from the G-forces. He did not see his bombs hit because he was already climbing and turning away, but his gunner radioed that 2 had skipped perfectly and disappeared under the waterline amidships. And 4 seconds later, the transport erupted in a geyser of flame and debris that climbed higher than the surrounding destroyer's masts. Bloomer made 3 more passes that day, expending all his ammunition and ordnance. And when he landed back at base 6 hours later, his A-20 had over 40 holes in it from anti-aircraft fire. 1 engine was running rough, and his gunner was wounded in the shoulder from shrapnel that had come through the canopy. Intelligence reports later confirmed that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea had been a catastrophe for the Japanese. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk, fewer than 1,000 of the 7,000 troops surviving, and the entire operation completed in 3 days with losses so lopsided that Japanese commanders refused to attempt another major convoy operation in the theater for the rest of the war. A-20 Havocs had flown the majority of the low-level strikes, and their skip-bombing attacks had accounted for at least 6 of the transport kills. The aircraft that German advisors had called an export reject had just changed the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The Soviets used the A-20 differently than the Americans, which made sense because the Eastern Front was a different war entirely, one where close air support and tactical bombing mattered more than strategic strikes, and where aircraft life expectancy was measured in weeks rather than months. The Soviet Air Forces received over 3,000 A-20s through Lend-Lease, making it one of the most numerous foreign aircraft in their inventory, and they flew them in roles that American commanders would have considered insane. Soviet A-20 crews routinely conducted missions at night without navigation equipment, using nothing but dead reckoning and visual landmarks to find targets hundreds of miles behind German lines. They modified their aircraft to carry RS-82 rockets under the wings, unguided projectiles with high-explosive warheads that were wildly inaccurate but psychologically devastating when fired in salvos at ground targets. They stripped out defensive armament to increase speed and payload, operating on the theory that the best defense was not getting caught in the first place. And if you were caught, you were probably dead anyway, so the extra guns would not save you. Soviet pilots called the A-20 the Bostanchik, a diminutive that roughly translated to Little Boston, and they spoke of it with the kind of affection that soldiers reserve for equipment that keeps them alive when everything else is trying to kill them. The aircraft's ruggedness impressed crews who were used to flying Soviet-designed bombers that could barely survive a single mission over contested airspace. The A-20 could take hits from 20mm cannon fire, lose an engine, and still make it home. It could operate from primitive airstrips that would have destroyed aircraft with tail wheels. Its engines were reliable in the extreme cold of the Russian winter, a quality that Soviet mechanics particularly appreciated because their own radial engines often refused to start when temperatures dropped below -20 Celsius. And its payload capacity meant that a single A-20 could deliver as much ordnance as 2 or 3 of the lighter Soviet bombers, which mattered immensely in a war where the Soviet strategy was often built around overwhelming the enemy with sheer volume of firepower. One Soviet pilot, Captain Mikhail Odintsov, flew over 200 missions in A-20s and survived the entire war, a statistical miracle on the Eastern Front where bomber crew life expectancy was often less than 10 missions. He later wrote that the A-20 was the reason he survived, that its speed allowed him to outrun German fighters when they caught him away from friendly airspace, that its toughness allowed him to absorb damage that would have killed him in any other aircraft, and that its versatility allowed him to adapt to whatever mission his commanders assigned without needing specialized equipment or training. He recounted one mission in the summer of 1944 where his squadron was tasked with destroying a German tank column that was moving at night to avoid daytime air attacks. They found the column using flares dropped by a reconnaissance aircraft, then made repeated passes at less than 100 feet, dropping fragmentation bombs and firing their nose guns at the thin top armor of the tanks. Odintsov's aircraft was hit multiple times by machine gun fire from the column's anti-aircraft vehicles, but the A-20 absorbed the punishment and continued flying, and by the time they returned to base, intelligence estimated that the squadron had destroyed or damaged over 30 tanks and dozens of support vehicles. The German column never reached its destination. The Germans learned to fear the A-20 not because it was invincible, but because it operated in the gap between what their defenses were designed to counter. German flak systems were optimized for high-altitude bombers, with predictive computers and long-range guns that could accurately engage targets at 20,000 feet or higher. German fighters were trained to intercept bombers at medium and high altitudes, where they could use their speed and climb rate advantages to position for attacks. But the A-20 flew below the effective ceiling of heavy flak, too low for the predictive systems to track, and too fast at low altitude for fighters to catch unless they happened to be in exactly the right position when the attack began. This created a tactical problem that German defenders never adequately solved. By the time they saw the A-20s coming, it was often too late to react, and by the time they organized a response, the A-20s were already gone. A Luftwaffe after-action report from Italy in 1944 described an attack by A-20s on a supply depot near Cassino and the frustration in the language was evident even in translation. The report noted that the attacking aircraft approached at extremely low altitude, below 100 meters, using terrain features to mask their approach until they were within 2 kilometers of the target. Defensive positions opened fire as soon as the aircraft were spotted, but the angle was wrong for the heavy flak guns, which could not depress low enough to engage effectively, and the light flak guns had insufficient time to track and fire before the aircraft were overhead. The attack lasted less than 90 seconds from first sighting to last aircraft departing, and in that time the A-20s had destroyed 4 ammunition bunkers, set fire to a fuel dump, and cratered the main access road with delay fuse bombs. Estimated casualties were listed as over 200 killed or wounded, and the depot was rendered non-operational for 3 days. The report concluded with a request for more light flak guns positioned specifically to defend against low-altitude attacks, but noted that even with improved defenses, the speed and surprise of such attacks made effective defense extremely difficult. German soldiers who survived A-20 attacks described them in terms that emphasized the psychological impact as much as the physical destruction. The sound of the engines was distinctive, a high-pitched roar that gave only seconds of warning before the aircraft appeared, and the sight of them coming in at treetop height created a visceral terror that high-altitude bombing did not. When you heard the B-17s overhead, you had time to take cover, time to prepare, time to convince yourself that the bombs might hit somewhere else. When you heard the A-20s, you had time to realize you were about to die and nothing else. The machine gun fire arrived first, a horizontal hail of 50 caliber rounds that shredded anything not protected by heavy cover, followed immediately by the bombs, and then the aircraft were gone before you could even process what had happened. One German infantry officer captured in France in 1944 told his interrogators that his battalion had been strafed by A-20s while moving through a forest, and the attack had killed 30 men and destroyed 6 vehicles in less than a minute. And the psychological effect had been so severe that his troops refused to move during daylight for the next 3 days. By the time the war ended in 1945, the A-20 Havoc had flown more combat missions than almost any other American bomber, served in every theater where American forces fought, and been used by more Allied nations than any other aircraft except perhaps the C-47 transport. The final production numbers told part of the story: 7,478 aircraft built, more than 3,000 sent to the Soviet Union, nearly 1,800 to Britain, and the rest split between American units in the Pacific, Mediterranean, and European theaters. But numbers alone could not capture what the A-20 represented in the evolution of air warfare. It was the first true multi-role combat aircraft, capable of level bombing, skip bombing, ground attack, anti-shipping strikes, night interdiction, and even reconnaissance, all without major modifications beyond swapping nose configurations. It proved that specialization was less important than adaptability, that a good aircraft designed to do many things adequately was often more valuable than an excellent aircraft designed to do one thing perfectly. The legacy of the A-20 extended beyond its service record into the design philosophy that shaped post-war attack aircraft. The A-26 Invader, which began replacing the A-20 in 1944, was essentially an evolution of the same concept, a twin-engine attack bomber with heavy forward-firing armament and the speed to survive at low altitude. The Air Force's later A-1 Skyraider, despite being a single-engine design, inherited the A-20's philosophy of carrying maximum ordnance and loitering over the battlefield to provide close support. Even a modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed 4 decades after the A-20, shared the same fundamental approach: heavy gun armament, substantial payload capacity, and the ability to operate effectively at low altitude in contested airspace. The A-20 had established a template that proved so effective it has never been completely abandoned. Perhaps the best measure of the A-20's impact came from the enemies who faced it. German military records captured after the war showed that A-20 attacks were consistently rated as more disruptive to operations and attacks by larger bombers. Not because they caused more total damage, but because they caused damage precisely where it mattered most: supply lines, forward positions, and tactical targets that strategic bombers could not effectively engage. Japanese after-action reports from the Pacific identified the A-20 as one of the primary threats to shipping and ground forces, ranking it alongside the P-38 Lightning as aircraft that fundamentally changed Japanese defensive calculations. Soviet assessments were perhaps most telling. They evaluated the A-20 as superior to their own comparable bombers in almost every category, and continued requesting them through Lend-Lease even when Soviet aircraft production was at its peak, which suggested that the aircraft qualities were not just adequate but irreplaceable. The export reject that German advisors had mocked in 1942 had become, by 1945, one of the most respected and feared combat aircraft of the entire war, and the crews who flew it had rewritten the rules of low-altitude attack in ways that would influence air combat doctrine for generations.